The Limits of Solidarity. On Diaspora Jewry's Relationship to Israel. Published in 1977 by Jean Améry. If the dire portents are anything to go by, it would seem that the political and military forces in the Middle East are preparing for another leap likely to imperil the world. A further war between the tiny state of Israel and the powerful Arab world may end as the previous ones have. Should the Israelis be victorious, it would merely be the prelude to further, ever new armed conflicts. Should the Israeli Jews be defeated, it would inevitably precipitate the physical annihilation of an incalculable number of the country's Jewish inhabitants. One way or the other, because one day the immense economic, military, and potential technological advantage of the Arabs, which is currently still latent to some degree but will become evident in the near or not too distant future, will manifest as its comprehensive historical supremacy. The tragic result would be a catastrophe on par with Auschwitz. At that point, the God of the Jews will no more be able to protect his people than he was between 1941 and 1945. He is either the Lord and Slayer or a weakling, or maybe, in his mysteriousness, he is both. Taking this into account, is this the right point in time to chart on an imaginary moral map the limits of the solidarity that binds diaspora Jewry to Israel? Is it permissible to do so when an incredibly vicious anti-Zionist / anti-Semitic campaign based on the tried and tested phantasm of a worldwide conspiracy, perpetrated by the supposedly chosen people against humanity in its entirety, is being acted out in the USSR, when a substantial section of the independent left is intellectually aligning itself with the strikers and stürmers of the ostensibly socialist countries to stab the unglamorous and isolated state of Israel in the back, an expression that in this instance would not be cheap hyperbole. It certainly is, unless one is willing to compromise one's commitment to the unity of morality and enlightenment. It is not only permissible but necessary. The fact that Prime Minister Begin, with the Torah in his arm and taking recourse to biblical promises, refers against all reason and historical insight to the occupied parts of the Jordanian West Bank as, quote, liberated, end quote, and is intent on acting accordingly. This alone would be reason enough for Jews in the diaspora to review their relationship to Israel. Needless to say, it is inconceivable that they would revoke their pact of solidarity with the country. Quote, Jews and persons classified as Jews according to the Reich's citizenship law for the protection of German blood, end quote, continue to be defined by the non-Jews' gaze. Even where German blood is not at stake, their lot is inextricably linked. Israel is innately their cause, regardless of how they seek shelter as statesmen, be they American, French, or Austrian, as flustered, quote, leftist, end quote, writers desperately clinging to the young, or pseudo-objective observers of political processes. They assume they can contemplate and elucidate subspecie aeternitatis. Footnote. Translation from a universal perspective. A universal perspective, not perspective. In Harlem, New York, Paris, Buenos Aires, and who knows where else, as soon as push comes to shove, the non-Jews will inform them that they are indeed Jews, half-Jews, quarter-Jews, or in some way of, quote, Jewish kin, end quote. The gallows and the bunker notwithstanding, Streicher and his master are still in charge. His master refers to Hitler. As long as a single anti-Semite exists, all Jews are connected to one another. The existential pact of solidarity between Diaspora, Jewry, and Israel contains no expiry clause. Even so, or rather, precisely for this reason, the contract partners in the Diaspora are duty-bound to warn their partner in Israel, obviously in full awareness of the interminable nature of the basic pact between them, but also in the clearest possible terms of the point at which, and the reasons why, they would be forced not to break. This is inconceivable, but to loosen the bond between them because there are higher, albeit more abstract, commitments at stake. I have seen, admittedly ambiguous and sketchy reports on the alleged systematic use of torture against Arab prisoners in Israeli jails, and heard the Israelis' sonorous but not entirely convincing denials. I know virtually nothing about what goes on in Israeli prisons. How indeed could I or anyone else have authentic knowledge of these things? Whatever the truth value of the official Israeli or the unverifiable Arab version of events may be, I want to affirm as emphatically as I can, though this in no way draws my existential connection to Israel into question, that I share the anguish of every victim of torture, even if he is an Arab terrorist with blood on his hands. In my value system, for all that I have experienced the full horror of its concretization, the abstract category, quote, human being, end quote, outranks the concept, quote, Jew, end quote. I urgently call on all Jews who want to be human beings to join me in the radical condemnation of systematic torture. Where barbarism begins, even existential commitments must end. The abstract commandments of morality take precedence. They should and must take precedence over all existential considerations. Moreover, no moderately rational person can accept that a social commonwealth is based on rabbinic laws, that legends are turned into, quote, history, end quote, on which, in turn, current political claims are based. I state this with a lesser degree of moral certitude and do not presume to demand that every Jew should join me in this judgment. I am, however, in agreement with a not insignificant number of intellectually emancipated Jews whose approach is unself-consciously secular when I say that the, quote, splendor, end quote, of Judaism has always been not its, as Freud would say, compulsive neurotic orthodoxy, but its ability to transcend traditional modes of being, and that its, quote, affliction, end quote, albeit also its mysterious paradoxical mode of survival, has been its grim and rigid adherence to religious tradition. From Heine, Marx, Freud, and Bergson, all the way to the young French philosophers and Jewish novelists in New York and Chicago, who are more or less our contemporaries, they have all gained prestige and made an impact, not as Jews, but as self-transcending Jewish human beings. Consequently, the existence of the State of Israel cannot be justified with recourse to a trove of legends, however dignified its patina, however significant it may be, but only with the human mission embodied by the Jews of the Emancipation era, and the equally human demand that the Jews, as a free people, should stand on their own free ground, given that, to this day, the hospitality of all the various, quote, host peoples, end quote, continues to be precarious at best. Human mission? Maybe this is just another unjustified and presumptuous claim. Why should it be the Jews of all the people on earth who have had the obligation and noble task bestowed on them to engage in this Promethean task? Does a Jew who speaks of the moral mission of the Jews not succumb to the conceit of election that plays such a prominent role in both overt and covert anti-Semitic agitation? Well, if one assumes history to be more than the value-free compilation and registration of data concerning events with no inherent meaning, there is no getting around the fact that the survival of the Jews runs counter to history. Their temporality and historicity are presupposed. The Jews are tasked with self-legitimation in Israel and the diaspora alike. That said, Diaspora Jewry, the infamous, quote, world Jewry, end quote, if you like, is better equipped to fulfill the task that rests on the Jews' shoulders because it need not resist the temptation of engaging in realpolitik. Or realpolitik. I don't know how you, I should know how you pronounce that, but I don't. Anyway. All this may sound like unsolicited advice emanating from a safe port. You lot in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem treat the terrorists who oppose you and who have long since transgressed the bounds of morality with a measure of humanity that goes to the limits of your moral strength and the politically viable. Acknowledging that your freedom can be achieved only with your Palestinian cousin, not against him. Acknowledge that your freedom can be achieved only with your Palestinian cousin, not against him, even though as yet he shows no interest in freedom and, in his thirst for revenge, only wants to cut your throat. Even so, accept this advice, for the port from which it comes is anything but safe, and those from whom it comes are standing with their backs to the wall just as much as you are. Do not let the irrevocable solidarity that binds us together become the basis for a communion of two doomed parties in the face of catastrophe. Given the burgeoning anti-Semitism once again rearing its head the world over from the extreme right to the radical left, there can be no doubt that the Jews in the diaspora and those in the state of Israel depend on each other. The former cannot hold their heads high unless the latter exists, and the latter cannot manage without the moral support of the former, which will have to be of greater significance in the long run than their material assistance. The donations of the U.S. Hasidim, or Hasidim, Hasidim, and the lobbying of the Jewish Americans who are afflicted, not only spiritually, by the problem of dual loyalties cannot replace the unconditional support of the enlightened and emancipated Jews in the diaspora, who will remain bound to the state of Israel regardless of the circumstances, but who can only defend it against a hostile world with a clear conscience, as long as it serves as an outpost not of, quote, imperialism, end quote, as equally thoughtless and unscrupulous people claim, but of democracy and humanity, both of which are indivisible and neither of which can be compromised. As yet, the Israeli Prime Minister and his visitation by biblical visions notwithstanding, Israel is such an outpost. Compared to most of the states in the third and fourth world, the country is a paradise, and this would hold true even if the compromising reports were verified. But for how long? This is the pressing question that concerns not only Israel and the Jews. The answer must come not so much from those who hold positions of responsibility, but primarily from those possessed of an actual sense of responsibility.